Great. Well, thank you very much, Wayne, for your always kind introduction and for your prayer. And thank you for everybody who's taken time on a Wednesday evening to join this workshop. You know, this is a sensitive topic, and it's also one that I'm really privileged and honored to talk about because I think it's very important. I actually did a video 2 years ago at the beginning of the pandemic. It was on my heart and mind, and I filmed a video on my YouTube channel, and it was called Global Grief. And just with the pandemic beginning, I thought, let's talk about grief, because even at the beginning, 2 years ago, we could see the many compounding, ambiguous, and complex losses that a lot of people were experiencing. You know, people that couldn't go to prom, people that couldn't see loved ones in nursing homes, on and on and on, even just in the first few months. And now 2 years later, over 2 years later, you know, I'm doing a workshop that we initially had titled Post-Pandemic Grief. And while none of us know the future, certainly I think we can all agree that the last 2 years, there has been a lot of things that we've emotionally had to navigate as best that we can. And I'm hopeful this presentation will be helpful either for you or people you know that have been impacted by what we've been walking through as a world, really, quite frankly. And as Wayne said, my name is Anne-Marie. I love making mental health and emotional wellness knowledge accessible for people. I think that it's something that multiplies. So really honored to be here. And I will share my screen back and forth. Those of you who see me before, you know that this can be a little bit bumpy, but hopefully it's okay. And hopefully everybody can see this. If not, someone will need to open up their mic because I can't see any of you while I do this. But this presentation is post-pandemic grief. And the things we're going to talk about today are a little bit, I'm just going to touch on the emotional complexity of the pandemic because it has been very complex. And I say that with all seriousness. The process of grief I'm going to cover. And you know, maybe many of you know the process and the stages of grief, but hopefully I'll bring some new knowledge today to hopefully validate maybe some things that you've been experiencing. We're going to touch on post-pandemic emotions because this is a thing that we're noticing. There's a surge of emotions, of pent-up, suppressed emotions post-pandemic. So I want to talk about that. And then talk about how we can take care of ourselves. All this information is helpful if we know now what. What can I do about this? Now that I know that I've been struggling, I've been grieving, what are the next steps? So if you've heard me speak before, I talk a lot about our survival response. When we go in a time of stress or trauma, our body's innate alarm system gets kicked into gear, our fight, flight, freeze response. And with this pandemic, we've been in the fight or flight, most of us, for the last 2 years. So we've been in survival mode. We've just been navigating a lot of change constantly, been navigating a lot of bad news constantly. Even if you've been optimistic, even if you've been hopeful, it's been a stressful time. Even if your mind coped well, you know, thinking positive, finding the silver linings. I think when the pandemic started, we were all doing Pinterest projects and renovating our homes. Even if we've handled it well, our bodies and our emotions have been in a stressful state, in survival mode. And because of that, because survival was prioritized, we haven't had a chance to actually process the emotions that we felt because of the pandemic. These emotions might be anxiety, they might be sadness, and it might be grief, among many, many other things. And when I'm talking throughout this presentation, I would really invite you to not just think of grief in how maybe you've normally thought of it. Of course, grief is when you've lost a loved one. And I'm sure in the last 2 years, there's probably a lot of people that have lost someone that they've cared about. My understanding even from Wayne is the church, even recently in the last few months, has had a number of funerals. So this is something that is very real, that has been happening. And grief can be many other things. Grief is definitely the loss of a loved one, but grief can also be, you know, a marriage that didn't work out, a relationship that didn't work out. It can be grieving expectations, you know, kids that had to delay going to university, people that had to leave jobs because maybe they disagreed with certain mandates. There's a lot of complex grief that's been happening because of this pandemic. So even if you haven't lost a loved one, I'm going to suggest that this grieving idea still applies to you. Whether it was even grieving the inability to see your friends for a period of time with the lockdowns, grieving not being able to go to a grocery store and see smiling faces. There's layers to this. And this is why we think, why Wayne really suggested this presentation, I think, because it is just so relevant for everyone. And so now, post-pandemic, or may I say, at least in this window of time where we have a bit of a break, maybe, if that's a fair way to put it, and forgive me, I'm not a doctor, I'm a social worker, so I might not have all the proper terms. Now is when we're seeing these emotions come to the surface, and we need to start addressing all these things that we've lost. So I'm going to talk to you about the stages of grief. Historically, we thought there were 5 stages of grief. Now they're suggesting that there are 6. I want to be very clear as I go through this, that these stages are not necessarily linear. It's not necessarily that we fit people into a box, that you're in this stage so that you're feeling this way. It's actually quite fluid. But my hope is by sharing the information about these stages, it will really validate a lot of what you're experiencing. Because this is grief about the pandemic. It could be grief about a loved one that you know. And I also want to say that if you are grieving or feeling raw emotions, even during this presentation, to be kind to yourself. If you need to mute me for a little bit and take 5 minutes away, all of that is okay. So please be mindful of that as well. So one of the stages of grief, which is suggested to be the first stage, but again, it's not linear necessarily, is denial. And denial is actually a way that we can cope with the grief, with the loss, because it doesn't make sense. Life doesn't make sense. And we're in a state of shock. So we cope with that shock with denial. And this is when we might feel detached from the world. We might just be going through the motions. When someone loses a loved one, it can be just such a whirlwind. And then there's a funeral. And before you know it, it's a few weeks later. And where does that time even go? It feels like forever, and yet it feels like no time has passed at all. And that's the denial stage. The body is in shock. The emotions are suppressed to help you survive the loss. I've talked to you guys a lot about our nervous system. And if you've seen me before, some of you haven't been with me before, but I use a slinky to describe our autonomic nervous system, which is our fight or flight response. So our alarm, when something is wrong, when there's a stressor, we have a fight or flight response that allows us to either, if it was a bear attacking us, we could fight off the bear, or we could run away from it, or we could freeze and lay down and become catatonic so that we basically play dead. That's in all of us. And when grief happens, especially when it's a shock or a sudden tragedy, that can happen to us. We just collapse into a frozen state, and that can be the denial stage of grief. It's too much to take in, it's too much to handle, so all we can do is sort of shut down and survive. And that can happen when we lose a loved one. It can also happen when we just get lots of bad news. And the grief we've been experiencing through this pandemic would count. And a lot of people have been in denial. A lot of us, well-meaning, when the pandemic was first starting, maybe we were in a bit of denial, 2 weeks to flatten the curve. Okay. We can look back now and say, well, maybe that was optimistic thinking. That was hopeful thinking. It was also a way to cope with what was coming down the pipe. As you begin to heal, the feelings that were being denied begin to surface. And I want to also be clear that if anyone is in a denial phase of grief, you're doing nothing wrong. This is a natural part of grief. Anger is also a natural part of grief. And when I counsel people who are grieving and they're angry, they think something's wrong with them. And it's so important that we normalize that it's absolutely appropriate to be angry when you've lost something, because it shouldn't happen. It is unfair. It's okay to say those things. It's natural to feel deserted, abandoned, or out of control. A lot of people might ask, why? Why, God? Why did this have to happen? And I can tell you that's happened with the pandemic. Why is this happening? Anger is actually a strength, because it can start to get you connected to those emotions that were suppressed, because it's safer to feel anger than it is to feel sadness. It's easier to feel anger than it is to feel sadness. And so it starts to anchor you back into your emotions regarding the loss, regarding the pain, regarding the grief. It can give you strength compared to the nothingness you felt with the denial. And underneath your anger is your pain. Bargaining is another stage of grief. It's probably one of the less understood stages. And I describe it as the what if and the if only stage of grief. So, what if this didn't happen? Or if only they hadn't done that day, maybe they would still be here. With the pandemic, what if we had all isolated properly? I don't know. There's been so many things we could have said. Or what if we handled it differently? Or what if they came out with a vaccine sooner? If only, if only that person hadn't gone to that nursing home and visited that loved one, then maybe it wouldn't have spread. This is part of grief, bargaining. What it does is we try to find some sense of control with loss. If only I could have gone to university when I wanted to, but I couldn't because of the pandemic. Why did that have to happen? And we want life to return to the way it was before the loss. A lot of us want to return to normal life before the pandemic. And this causes us to find fault in ourselves, in God, or in the world. And one thing I've seen a lot during the pandemic is there's a lot of discord because people are often on one side or the other. I don't think I've ever seen an experience where they're so value driven, because when it comes to life and death, our values are quite strong. And when it comes to a pandemic, inherently that applies to life and death. And so there's a lot of discord and people disagreeing with each other, be vaccinated, not be vaccinated, the trucker convoy, not the trucker convoy. And I want to actually suggest that a lot of that is the bargaining stage of grief. We're struggling with understanding what's going on, and we have strong viewpoints, and we say, what if, and why do they believe this? And it's actually a way that we're trying to process what we can't control. Because I don't think that humans want to not get along as much as we haven't been. I think we're all struggling with a complex emotional experience of grief, and it's not been normalized enough. We've just been surviving. We've just been trying to get through. So perhaps, and I can say this because I work with a lot of people, if there's tensions even in your own family, it could be because of something like this. We're just trying to wrap our head around what we've lost. And we might be on different pages, but we are going through the same experience, grief. Depression. This is what people think of when they think of grief. They think of sadness, but I've just described to you, what was it? 3 stages that weren't depression: shock, denial, bargaining, anger. The depression stage of grief is now when we're present in the loss. We're feeling the weight of the loss. And because we've gone through the other stages, we can get to this one. We can really feel it. We've survived the shock. We've processed the anger, which felt safer to feel than the sadness. We've asked questions, and now clunk. It's hit us. It's real. Grief is different for everyone, but it can be quite normal when you've lost a loved one for the depression stage to not hit for 6 months. That doesn't seem to make sense on the surface. Of course, you're sad when you lose someone you care about, or you're sad with the many complex losses with the pandemic. But sometimes the real depth and the weight and the reality of that sadness doesn't hit for many months later. And the difficulty with this is the way we grieve as a society. If you lose someone, the funeral is usually within a week or two. You get cards for those first couple of weeks, maybe up to a month. People bring you casseroles and they send you well wishes. But when you're really struggling, 6 months later, the world has moved on. People don't realize they're not with you in the grief anymore because they think it's okay now. It's been 6 months. And 6 months is actually when the work to really heal begins. If people come to me for counseling when they're grieving, I will honestly tell them that it's wait about 6 months before you do counseling, unless the counseling is about managing through the shock. Because really, to work through grief, some time needs to elapse so that you can reconnect with your emotions and experience the loss. Looking through the lens of the pandemic, for some people who may not have lost a loved one, 2 years have gone by and it's just kind of hitting us. the weight of what we've been experiencing. And so many people are finding they're struggling with depression and they don't know why. It's because of 2 years of complex emotions and living in this state of shock and survival mode. And now we're feeling the weight of it. Now we're in a place where we're starting to be ready to process it because we're feeling a little bit safer. And I want to be very clear that when people are struggling with the depression stage of grief, it's not a sign of mental illness. It's an appropriate response to loss. Can it become a diagnosable mental health issue like depression? Yes, it can. People can get stuck in their grief, especially when it's complex and traumatic. And really all the grief is complex, but there's certain grief that can be very, very difficult to move forward from. And so it can become diagnosable, but it is completely normal to feel this depression for some time. You know, one of the people that I've supported, they gave me permission to quote them, and I always do. They said that, oh gosh, what was their quote? I haven't said it recently. What is grief? But grief shows that love has left a void that needs to be filled. So the weight of the grief can often indicate the weight of the love that was lost. Acceptance. Now, historically, this was the 5th stage of grief and the final stage, but now it's the 2nd to final stage. Acceptance does not mean we are okay with what we've lost or that we've gotten over it. It's about accepting the reality of the loss and moving forward with it. So we don't move on from grief. We move forward with it. We learn to readjust. We learn to find a new normal rather than trying to keep things the way they were. Remember the bargaining stage? We just want life to be like it was before the pandemic. With acceptance, we accept, okay, life has changed. How do we adjust? How do we adapt? And we slowly start to find meaning in life again. My hope for everyone is that they can come to a place of acceptance. It doesn't mean what happened didn't matter. It doesn't mean that you don't still feel the loss. It means that you're learning to move forward with the loss and still find meaning and purpose and joy and hope in your life again, which leads to the final stage of grief, which is meaning making. And this is newer. It's something that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who came up with these stages of grief, it was added later on. But it's interesting to me as a therapist because meaning making is something we've known about for a long time in trauma therapy. Meaning making is important in trauma to help people heal from a traumatic experience, to make sense of their traumatic experience. And it makes perfect sense to me that it would be an important stage of grief because grief is traumatic, inherently traumatic. And so we discovered that an important part of healing is finding meaning and purpose. It doesn't mean that what happened was supposed to happen. Sometimes people think, oh, if you find meaning, it must mean that it was meant to happen. I was meant to lose my loved one, or the pandemic was meant to happen. And I'm not going to necessarily say whether or not that's right or wrong. But what this stage is trying to say is that we need to find meaning in what happened because it happened. We get to rewrite the story of our loss. And this looks like different things for different people. You know, I heard at the very beginning of the pandemic that people were already rushing to find some meaning in their loss. And they were saying, you know, I'm closer to my family than I've ever been. Or, you know, it made me get rid of all the clutter of my life because I couldn't be social. I couldn't do all these extracurricular things. And it reminded me of what was really important. Those are actually examples of meaning making. They're also examples of just trying to be optimistic, but they are also meaning making opportunities. You know, I often share my meaning making story. I had a family member with a very serious mental health issue. And because of that, I went into social work. I became a therapist, and I love helping people who struggle with mental and emotional wellness difficulties. That's meaning making for me. I took what was my experience, my story, and I'm rewriting it. I get to continue writing my story and create a meaningful ending. And that is part of grief, is how do we rewrite it? How do we find purpose? How do we find something to make some sense of what we went through? Not that it was meant to happen, but how can we draw good from it? The challenge is, and this is the important part, because I work with a lot of optimistic, silver lining people. We're not meant to rush there. So people did that at the beginning of the pandemic. They said, let's find meaning, let's find purpose, without processing the anger and the shock and the depression that would come with so many complex losses. And the result of that can actually cause burnout. Because what happens is I think positive things and meaningful things with my brain, but my body's saying, wait a minute, I'm like waving the white flag here. I'm stressed, I'm depressed, I'm struggling. You need to give me a voice. And so because people rush to be positive, they rush to find meaning, all that got swallowed and they got emotional indigestion. That's what I like to call it, emotional indigestion. A lot of us are walking around with emotional indigestion. So my encouragement, as I'm going to give you some next steps now that we've been talking about grief, the encouragement will be to allow yourself to process all of these emotions and then find meaning rather than jumping to it quickly. If you ever want more information on that, I do have a video. The title is so random, but it kind of makes sense. And it's The Optimist Struggle with COVID. Because when we were optimistic and hopeful, we rushed through the process and we suppressed emotions and we got emotional indigestion. Go back to my screen here. So I said at the beginning that grief is not linear. And I know I kept on saying the first stage, the second stage, and I did that just so that I could communicate it. The truth is grief is more like a roller coaster. And with roller coasters, if you've been on one, is that sometimes there are big loops. Sometimes there's a lot of big loops, and sometimes they're smooth sailing, and sometimes there's a sudden curve when you were least expecting it. Grief is like that. It's sort of like you go on this roller coaster, you weren't expecting to be on it in the first place, and there's a lot of loops really quickly, a lot of turns, you don't even have time to take it all in. And then maybe after a while, there's a little bit, a pocket of smooth sailing where it starts to feel a little bit better, maybe I'm okay, oh, and then there's another dip and another turn. And grief can be like that. And what happens is over time, if somebody is working through grief, the loops come a little less often. They can still be very intense, but they're not constant. They're not there all the time. And I find that's what the grieving journey can be like. It's a lot at once. It's unpredictable. It's not linear. And then sometimes it's a little more peaceful with still sometimes intense emotions with some breaks. And what that looks like is, maybe somebody has been processing their loss. Maybe it's a year later. It's mostly smooth sailing. They feel like they're healing. They found some meaning. They're moving on with life, with the grief. And then Christmas comes. And Christmas is a huge trigger when you've lost someone you care about. Christmas has been a huge trigger during the pandemic because we couldn't be with families and different challenges, or people had different comfort levels, and that could be really painful. Some wanted to get together, some didn't. That was a big loop on the roller coaster because it was a trigger. And that can be the journey of grief for a long time. Is maybe it's smooth sailing, maybe it's getting better, maybe it's more manageable. There might always be those big and unpredictable loops. Now, before I start to segue into how to cope with grief, I want to just acknowledge another component about grief. And here's a quote to welcome that. So there is no grief like the grief that does not speak. And historically, all cultures around the world were very good at grief. They would have symbolic activity, powerful ritual with intense emoting. And I looked around, there's Chinese culture, ancient Egypt, Hebrew culture. There's a lot of cultures around the world that have similarities in that it was specific, it was symbolic, it was ritualistic, and it was powerful. One of the things I like to share is, from biblical times, if someone died in Israel, the neighbors would come out, they would put on sackcloth and ashes, and the community would weep and wail around the house of the deceased for days. And it would be loud, and it would be very emotive, and it'd be expressive and physical. And while that might seem like sad and a bit much, it's super healthy, because what they've done is they've taken all that grief energy that's under the freezing, under the shock, under the I had to freeze to survive, and they let it all out. They were big, and it was emotive, and it was powerful, and people healed because they gave expression and voice, and they allowed the grief to speak, basically, was what I'm trying to say. And what do we do as a society now? Modern day Western culture. Okay, well, we have maybe a celebration of life and a funeral, and people come and they're very polite, and they might shake your hand and express their condolences, and the family is very brave and very strong, and they're there, and there's flowers and cards, and that's mostly it. And I realize I'm speaking for like Western, stereotypical culture, and we're multicultural, and there's different cultures in Canada and around the world. But generally speaking, we're very stoic in our grief. We try to survive it. We don't want to be messy. We want to be strong for our family. So we do our best. And that's well-meaning, but it just holds all that pain. And we've been doing that with this pandemic. We've tried to be strong. Parents have tried to be strong for their children. Teachers have tried to be strong for their students. Anyone who works in any kind of medical profession has tried to be strong for their patients. Pastors have tried to be strong for their churches. And we've all tried to handle this really well. And we've held on to all the emotions that we genuinely and authentically need to experience. I just walked you through 6 stages of grief. And maybe we've experienced 1 or 2. Maybe some of you walk through them, but generally speaking, I'm seeing people that are kind of stuck because they're burnt out and they've suppressed all those emotions. So historically, I think we did a good job. I think we knew what needed to happen when we lost someone. We needed to have symbolism. We needed to bring meaning. We needed to have a story. We needed to have ritual, to have closure, and to connect us with the deceased or with what we lost. And we needed to have powerful emoting so that we could express what was on our hearts in a powerful, powerful way. And we've lost that. So I want us to bring it back. And certainly it applies to what we've been through. And I mentioned this at the beginning, but post-pandemic, we're finding that there's an emotional surge. There's a trend where most people are experiencing all these pent-up emotions are kind of coming out like a volcano. And it's because of all the circumstances related to COVID-19 and the pandemic. So hospital admissions, death, fear, secondary stressors, changing jobs and not knowing what's going to happen with your job, and being off work and trying to figure out CERB, and life changes and social isolation and not being able to see your ill loved ones. And, people have lost loved ones and not even been able to have funerals, and postponed weddings and loss of autonomy. So all that's happened. And it's caused an increase of prolonged grief disorders across the world. This is what they're saying now. And I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but if anything, I want to normalize that all of that has been there, and it needs to come out. It wants to come out. And because it hasn't been able to, we're actually prolonging the grief in many people. So with all that context, hopefully at least I've validated maybe what some of you are experiencing. So what can we do? How can we take care of ourselves? We're still kind of in a pandemic state. We don't know what tomorrow holds. There have been losses. There might continue to be losses. How can we not only survive this, but how can we thrive in this state of the world? So I'm going to give you some next steps that are hopefully helpful and hopefully feasible. None of these hopefully are out of reach for all of us. So the first is simply to know what to expect. And that's why I focus so much of my presentations on giving you a clear understanding of what I'm talking about, like what is happening. Like, why do we need all this context, Anne-Marie? We know we've been through a pandemic. Well, if we know what to expect, if we can sort of connect the dots of, oh yeah, because of the last 2 years, oh yeah, I've been grieving. That makes sense. Yeah, I've probably been in a lot of shock and I've been more angry than normal. Okay, that does kind of make sense. If we can know what to expect, simply understanding the emotional surge will actually help us begin to process it. You've heard me say before, if you've attended any of my workshops, when you name an emotion, you tame an emotion. Just giving them voice, just validating them. It's like, oh, I've let out the valve. I've let out a little bit of the pressure. So that alone can help. Just knowing, oh, that I might be grieving, that makes sense, can help. So don't underestimate the power of awareness and validation, even if it's not for you, even if it's for other people in your life. Maybe some people in your family are more anxious or sad or agitated than normal. Well, we've got an understanding that makes a lot of sense of that. And we can validate, we can know what to expect. And that's part of the process. When I'm working with the person who's grieving in that window before the 6-month mark, remember I said you can't really do counseling until 6 months. Before that, a lot of the counseling or the support I try to provide is a lot of validation, just space for them to experience their pain, just normalizing that they might be in shock, that it's okay to be angry, because that gives them the freedom and the permission to process those emotions. And now that you guys know what to expect, my hope is that you give yourself freedom and permission to express those emotions. Which leads into the next encouragement I would have for you, is to feel your feelings with safety. So allow yourself space to feel what you are feeling without judgment, without filters, just like they would have done in Jewish culture when the neighbors come out and it was big and it was expressive. They didn't filter it. We can do that for ourselves, in the quietness of our own room, or, maybe when we're driving in our car with the radio on. Feel your emotions the way they naturally want to be experienced. This takes practice. I'll be completely honest with you. A lot of us aren't very good at this. We've just culturally not been taught how to feel our feelings. We know how to think our feelings. We can say, I think I feel bad and I think I'm having a hard day. But we don't know how to feel our feelings. And feelings are very physiological. They need to be felt. And so we can practice that. And some ways or examples of how you can feel your feelings, because yes, we do need to learn how to do this, is to cry. It might seem obvious, but many people don't know how to connect with tears, or they don't give themselves permission to, or they start to cry and they can feel the tears coming, but then they swallow it because they need to be strong. So crying can be a way to feel your feelings. Yelling can be a way to feel your feelings. And I think yelling is perfectly fine, because again, if it's coming out of the fight or flight response, if it's coming out of anger, your body wants you to yell. It wants you to close the loop on that trauma or that grief, and it wants you to do something with it, because it's saying something bad has happened. We need to do something with it. And so yelling is a way to send the message to your nervous system. Yeah, I'm mad and I need to vent it. Shaking is another one. This one's really interesting. So animals in the wild don't get post-traumatic stress disorder. And the reason why is because after they run away from a threat, so let's say a little bunny rabbit has gotten away from an animal that's trying to chase it, it'll shiver. And what it's doing is it's getting rid of all that extra pent up stress energy of the fight or flight response. So the fight or flight was triggered because it was being attacked. It had extra adrenaline and all the little animal hormones it needed to run away really fast. And if it did nothing else after that, all that trauma energy would stay in that little rabbit's body, but it shivers and it shakes and it gets rid of it. So with us, we can do the same thing. If you're having a hard day, if you've had bad news, if you're struggling with what's been going through the pandemic, you can shake it off and just like, and it might feel silly, but I've done it in front of all of you. So I can invite you to do it too. It actually helps. It actually releases some of that cortisol, the stress hormone. It releases some of the adrenaline, the active hormone. And it sends a message to my nervous system. Okay, Amory got that stuff out. She's better now. She can be calm. Sometimes that's all it takes. I encourage people when I've met with them, if we've had a heavy session, because that can happen, to just kind of shake it off afterwards. Just go for a walk or go in their car or go in the room and just kind of shake it off. So shaking can even be a way to connect with your emotions in a very natural, powerful way. Sorry, I'm going back to my screen share. Venting. We call it therapeutic release. We like to give it a fancy name, but basically it's venting, talking to a friend, talking to God, venting to the air, saying everything you're struggling with and allowing the emotions to come with it. Journaling can be a way to connect with your feelings. If feeling your feelings is foreign for you, writing about them can actually help, because writing is very tactile, it's very physical, and it connects us with what we're thinking in a less ambiguous way. Like just thinking is kind of ambiguous, it's kind of invisible, but I've put pen to paper and I'm writing what I'm thinking, I'm writing what I'm feeling. It just helps me start to anchor into it and connect, and I might be more likely able to feel. Another thing I recommend people is to go for a walk, talk to God, talk to yourself, but walking, adding movement can also help because it opens up the nervous system to open up those emotions that were frozen, right? The animal playing dead, all the emotions are squashed. When we're in shock and denial, all of our emotions are squashed. When we add movement, it can open that up and let a little bit of a release. If you've ever watched Finding Nemo, Dory, one of the fish, she goes, just keep swimming, just keep swimming, just keep swimming, swimming, swimming. And I say to people, just keep moving, because that can help us heal from trauma and stress. If we move and we get our body in motion, it can help emotions get in motion. So don't hold it in. And when I say feel your feelings in safety, grief can be very traumatic. The pandemic has been very traumatic. So we want to do this in a safe way. And if you're not used to it, or if it's really powerful, we want to add some grounding skills to be safe. So some grounding strategies to promote safety include things like taking a cold shower. It could be a warm shower too. Showers are helpful because we feel like we're being cleansed, and they're very sensory. We feel the water. If you take a cold shower, it activates your body's peace response. So that can be very grounding. That's why, going swimming in a pool or going in the lake or going polar diving, they're very healthy for you. They slow your heart rate down, and that can bring us calm. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 is a grounding technique that is very well known. You've probably heard me talk about it before. And it's using your senses. We are grounded by using our senses. And when I say grounded, I mean, bring us back to the present moment, bringing us back to a peaceful state when we feel agitated or overwhelmed. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 is when we name 5 things we can see, 4 things we can touch, 3 things we can hear, 2 things we can smell, 1 thing we can taste. And if you can't smell or taste any things, you would name your favorite smell and taste. And I might have gotten the order mixed up because I don't have it in front of me. But if you Google 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, it comes up. And I have handouts on it that I can share. If anyone asks through Wayne, I'll send the handout. Breathing. So rhythmic, paced breathing also helps us be grounded. The key is to breathe in through the nose, because when we breathe in through our mouth, it triggers our stress response. Because if I'm running away from a threat, I'm probably mouth breathing. So breathing in through your nose, breathing out through your mouth, making sure your belly goes out when you're breathing, not your chest. Your chest means you're breathing shallow. Your belly is where you do your deep breathing. And another key is we want our exhale to be slightly longer than our inhale. It doesn't matter how long you inhale or exhale. There's a million ways to do it. You can breathe in for 7, breathe out for 8. Another one is you can do 4, 4, 4. Breathe in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4. The key is that we're extending the exhale. That's all you have to remember, because when we're stressed, we take in too much oxygen. So we want to reduce our oxygen and increase our carbon dioxide. Hopefully this is making sense. I'm going through it quickly because I've covered all of this in previous workshops, but I did want to touch on it. So if you want to know more, I think I have an entire workshop with WMB on the YouTube page on toxic stress and how we can regulate our nervous system. And it's all about grounding techniques if you want more. Self-hug is another one that's really good. It's probably the favorite of people that I work with. They always say they like this one the best. They find it the most useful. And so what you do is you take your right hand, put it under your left armpit, take your left hand, put it on your right bicep. So your right hand is by your heart, and your other hand's on your bicep. And you just squeeze, you just embrace yourself tightly. And when I do this, it automatically makes me take a deep breath. And the reason why is because I'm activating my body's peace response. It's literally slowing down my autonomic nervous system. It's engaging my vagus nerve, which is my peace muscle, which calms me and grounds me. It also releases oxytocin, a cuddle hormone, which makes us feel loved and safe. It also is a physical grounding technique because I'm touching my body, so I'm using my sense of touch. It's also self-soothing, and there's another one. I'm forgetting the last one. But basically, there's 5 reasons why this is helpful for your body and helps ground you. So I really recommend it. And everybody that I give it to appreciates it because they find it really can help. So if you're trying to process intense emotions, this can, even if this is all you remember from today's workshop, this can help you ground you in a difficult moment. And I go back to sharing my screen, back and forth, back and forth. The butterfly technique is another one. And so this one you've probably seen me do before as well. If you put your hands on your collarbone like this, just resting there. I realize I'm going to hit my mic. Just bear with me so I can show you. And you would just tap your collarbone right and left. You know, not too hard, not too fast. It sounds so simple, but this is something fancy called bilateral stimulation. You're literally healing the hemispheres of your brain when you do this. It helps us heal from trauma. It's getting my right hemisphere talking to my left hemisphere. And when we go through trauma, our brain likes to compartmentalize to help us survive. So doing something simple like this gets them communicating again. And some people will even say they feel a bit of a tingling sensation on their head like this. And it's literally because your neurons are firing. It's like, why are you using your left hand on your right collarbone? And our brain's amazing. It's movement, and movement can be helpful when we're struggling with grief, when we're struggling with stress. And again, it just sort of naturally makes us calm down. So this can be another helpful one for people when you're trying to ground yourself. Different things work for different people. So if you find you like some better than others, that's okay. Go with it. There's not really right or wrong here. So that's the butterfly technique, another grounding mechanism. And then the use of a grounding object or phrase. So another grounding technique that I personally like is having a grounding object. I'm very tactile. And so if I'm ever nervous in a meeting, I might have a little grounding object in my hand, and that I just have it under the table or in my pocket. And, you could use a keychain that's very tactile. Another thing, my son put a little sticker on my phone, and I thought, oh, that's kind of neat. It's very tactile. It could be a nice little grounding object for me. So whatever works for you, but having a grounding object where you just kind of focus on touching it can help calm you down when you're struggling with intense emotions. A grounding phrase can also be helpful. Some people benefit from that. So I am safe, I am loved, I'm going to be okay. If you believe in God, you might want to use a scripture. I rest under the shadow of the Almighty. Under his wings I find refuge. Like something that is, he surrounds me with his favor as a shield, something that is meaningful to you to help ground you in that moment. So the key here is feel your feelings with safety, get messy, allow them to be processed, and then have safety strategies to ground yourself if you ever feel like you need to reset, or if you just feel like it got too intense. These are what keep you safe. Another part of coping with grief and healing from the grief we've all experienced over the last 2 years is try and get some extra rest and meet your basic needs. This might sound obvious, but it gets missed. People are busy, life is demanding, and emotions are tiring. And we tend to not give ourselves a lot of grace. Like, I shouldn't be so tired. Why am I so lazy? Why do I struggle getting out of bed? Well, you're emotionally exhausted. I guarantee it. Most of us are struggling with a bit of adrenal fatigue because, again, our fight or flight response has been activated for 2 years, almost nonstop. That's very tiring. So all of us probably need a little more sleep, a little more rest, a little more grace to take some space if we can. And this is where sometimes we have to get creative, delegate where we can, say no to things sometimes, maybe not scroll on our phone till midnight, put it down at 10 and go to bed at a good time. This is an act of kindness toward yourself. Ensure you're eating, ensure you're drinking water. When we're stressed, we tend to crave junk food, which in the moment is good, but it can be detrimental to our health. So another act of kindness is meeting your basic needs in a healthy way. Explore meaning. Remember, meaning making, an important part of grief. We don't want to jump to this. We don't want to, because we don't want to avoid our emotional experience, but it is also an important part of the journey nonetheless. So we don't want to miss this. So part of meaning making, if you feel that you're looking for that, is you can journal, just contemplate, reflect. It gives an opportunity to open up rewriting your story. Listen to music that you find meaningful and that you connect with. talk to others. I personally find talking to others really helpful in meaning making because people see things that I don't see, and they can really encourage us in our grief journey. Some people aren't very good at it. They tend to give advice, but if you've got some friends that are good at not giving advice, maybe those are the ones to talk to help you find meaning. Or you can even say to your friends, you know what, right now, I'm looking for just someone to listen and to bounce ideas off of. I'm not looking for advice. We're allowed to do that. It's setting boundaries. So explore meaning as you look at healing with the grief. And find community. This is so important. And this is such a challenge because isolation has been a big part of this pandemic. And yet isolation is the worst possible approach to grief. Remember, when we grieved well, historically, it was always in community, and it was with our neighbors. It was with people who cared about us. And we're still meant to do that. We're still meant to grieve in community. Again, whether the loss of a loved one or whether the loss of the many other complex things that we've been dealing with the pandemic, we need to do this with other people because it's a shared experience. Alone time is okay. I'm an introvert. I get it. Alone time is okay and sometimes necessary, but isolation is not. So find safe people to share your emotions with, even if it's a virtual format, even if you don't feel ready or safe to meet with other people publicly, find ways to connect creatively. Have a phone call with a family member, do a Zoom call with a friend, and you can both have your cup of coffee and talk, meet for breakfast. Find ways to connect with people and be emotional with each other. Share your vulnerabilities. That's how we heal. And finally, reach out for help. Meeting with a counselor to process through what you're going through can be very meaningful. If you've had counseling before, maybe it was a good experience, maybe it wasn't a good experience. Every counselor is different. So I would encourage you to give it another try if you've not had a great experience, because talking to someone who's removed from your situation can also be helpful. And hopefully all counselors will validate and normalize a lot of what you're experiencing and help you gauge where you're at in your grief journey and how you continue to move forward in your grief journey. Some medications can also be a helpful resource to get you through a particularly difficult time. And so that might be something you might want to talk to a medical professional about. I've worked with many people who they did everything right and they just needed a little bit of an antidepressant because maybe their serotonin was low. Sometimes we just need medications to help us through a difficult time, and that is okay. Other resources, I like to give people lots of resources, and these are just a few. If you think you do want to talk to a therapist, therapy can be expensive if you don't have insurance. Inkblot is relatively affordable therapy. I have a lot of colleagues who are in Inkblot. And the neat thing about Inkblot is you get like a free short session to see if you can find the right match for you, because finding the right match is really important. Bounce Back is a program. It's not really counseling, but it's coaching, and they have a lot of workbooks and videos for mental health. It's put on by the Canadian Mental Health Association National across Canada, and it's completely free. So, and there's been a lot of research with Bounce Back that people saw a tremendous increase in improvement of their mental health after following the program. So it's a free resource available to anyone in Ontario. Sorry, not Canada, in Ontario. It is also in BC though, so it's in some provinces. So you could Google it and see if Bounce Back is where you are. And then there's local resources. So if you're in Canada, contact your local Canadian Mental Health Association. They're all over Canada. They are a government-funded, not-for-profit mental health organization, and they're usually a good resource to say what's available in your area if you need support. So I like those to be available to people if you can't afford therapy and you think you need to talk to someone. Groups are also an option, and local Canadian mental health associations often put on a lot of groups. And with grief, groups can be very meaningful because you share experiences and you have peer support. And then also I have resources that I try to make available. I don't have as much time to dedicate to this as I wish, but I have an Instagram page and I usually post, really concrete, grounding techniques or ways to heal the freeze response if you're stuck in a freeze response, things like that. And then I have the YouTube channel and my website, just if it's helpful, because I really hope that people can take from this meaningful things to help them heal, because it's been a hard 2 years and we all need support in some way, shape, or form. So bless you all. Thank you for attending this presentation. I truly hope it's helpful. And I have a little bit of time for a few questions.